Like Douglas was saying, I do have an innate love for Mississippi. My older sister, she actually just graduated from Ole Miss. Again, the connection with my dad. I love Oxford. I've been to Jackson so many times, and so I feel like almost like this is partly home for me. But I went to the University of Kentucky. We were driving down the road, Douglas and I, when he picked me up from the airport today, and every car had a license plate tag that was either Mississippi State or Ole Miss. And I thought it was so funny because I started thinking about Kentucky, where it's very similar. It's either UK or Louisville. And so I want to add, I would have loved to go to a Mississippi school if they had swim teams, but neither Ole Miss or Mississippi State do. So if there's someone in this room I can talk to about that, let's talk. But I went to University of Kentucky, and I had just a phenomenal experience. I was able to finish my career last year proudly as a 12-time NCAA All-American. I'm a 5-time SEC champion. I'm actually the SEC record holder in the 200 butterfly, which makes me, I believe, the 8th fastest of all time ever, which also means I have these really big shoulders that I like to cover with these like puffy sleeves. But last year was the SEC Scholar Athlete of the Year, showcasing my want to excel in academics, and I was the SEC Community Service Leader of the Year. But really, just all of that to say that being successful at an elite level is far from easy, and it's a lifelong journey. But I'll give you guys kind of a background on what qualifies me to speak on the issue that I'm speaking on today. Last year, again, this was my senior year, I already had a weird college experience with COVID. COVID took the world by storm in March of, 2020? Well, our NCAA championships my sophomore year were in March, and so this canceled that. So it felt like I had trained my whole sophomore year for nothing. And so like Douglas said, we got sent home, which was nothing that we were used to, especially in a sport like swimming. There's no time off. We stayed at Kentucky all summer, all of the breaks. We got one day off for Christmas to go home with our families, and then we were right back to practice on the 26th. And so I felt like I had already been robbed in that way. And so after COVID, I came back to school, and I had set big goals for myself, and I set the goal of winning a national title, which I was more than capable of doing. And so last year, about November of 2021, which is the middle of our season, I was right on track to do so. I was ranked 3rd in the country behind one amazing female athlete who I was very familiar with because, like in most sports, your top tier athletes know of each other, regardless of where you compete in the country because you've grown up competing against each other. But the person who was ranked first, by seconds, I want to add, was a person I had never heard of before. So there were a couple red flags for me looking at this person. It was a senior who came out of nowhere, their senior year to post these times. They were from University of Pennsylvania, which is not a school that historically produces fast swimmers. They were ranked first in everything from the 100 freestyle, which is of course a sprint, to the mile, which is of course long distance. And so think of this in terms of running. You don't have your best 200-meter runner is not your best marathoner. But this is what we were seeing, and so still at the time, having no idea this was a biological male, none of it made sense until an article was posted disclosing that this swimmer, whose name is Leah Thomas, was formerly known as Will Thomas and swam 3 years on the men's side at University of Pennsylvania. And so when I heard this, I was of course shocked, but truthfully, I felt a bit relieved because I was able to look up who Will Thomas was. And when looking up Will Thomas, I could see that Will Thomas, at best, when competing in the men's category, was ranked 462nd. And so seeing this information, I thought, okay, it's blatantly obvious that this is unfair, and so surely the NCAA will not allow this person to compete with us when it matters at our national championships. But of course, that is not what we saw. About 3 weeks before our NCAA meet, they announced that Leah Thomas would in fact be competing against the women. And so I got to personally witness and feel the effect that this infringement and this injustice had on myself and my teammates and all of the D1 swimmers around the country who were at that meet. That first day, we sat on the sidelines and watched Leah Thomas win a national title, again, by seconds. And swimming, I want to add, seconds is a lot. This is a sport that's measured down to the 100th of a second. And when you have someone winning by body lengths, obviously, that's an anomaly. And so we sat on the side of the pool and we watched this happen. That next day, and that was in the 500 freestyle, and so that next day was the day that Leah Thomas and I competed against each other in the 200 freestyle. And so we swam that morning. We both qualified for finals. We swam finals, and almost impossibly enough, which now looking back I realize the role God has played in this whole situation, but almost impossibly enough, we tied. We went the exact same time down to the 100th of a second. And so upon tying, we went behind the little awards podium where they kind of march you out with these little trophies, and you're named an All-American, and of course it's a really amazing achievement. And so we go behind the awards podium, and the NCAA official looks at both myself and Thomas and says, "Great job, you guys tied, Leah, you get the trophy." And so I'm sitting there, and I say, and I question him, of course, which clearly he was not prepared to be questioned because no one had questioned anything they had done up until this point. And so I look at this official and I say, "I understand there's one trophy, we tied, I get it, but why are you adamant on giving this trophy to Thomas?" And he was taken aback and he says, "Well, we're just doing this in chronological order." And so I further question, I say, "Okay, what are you being chronological about, because we tied?" And he said, "Well, for photo purposes, Leah has to have the trophy. You can pose with this one, but you'll give it back. You'll go home empty-handed. We can eventually mail you one." And so this was the point when, well, of course I knew what was happening was wrong. I knew the unfair advantage to which we were at was wrong, and I knew being forced to change in a locker room with a biological male who was fully intact with male parts, I knew that was wrong. But when the NCAA reduced everything that I had worked my entire life for, everything my teammates, these girls, again, from around the country who were at this meet, everything we had worked our entire lives for, when they reduced it to a photo op for a man to validate his identity, that's when I truthfully was done kind of being suppressed. That's when I took my public stance in my views of how this is wrong and unfair. And when I speak for so many more than just myself. I could talk for hours about all the silencing that these girls are dealing with who are in my same position, which is why there are so few of us who are actually speaking out. But Leah Thomas's teammates, for example, they had to go to mandatory LGBTQ meetings every week. When they were concerned about changing in the locker room with Leah Thomas, and they sent an email to their administration responded back with, "If you feel uncomfortable seeing male genitalia, here's some counseling resources that you should seek." And then were, of course, referred to the campus LGBTQ Education Center to educate themselves on the oppression that Leah Thomas is dealing with. And I could talk about stories like that forever. And I know I kind of touched on the locker room piece, but I want to hit on it again because it's important. When the media uses the term, of course, transgender woman, I think the general public assumes that this is a person who has fully committed to transitioning, and it's someone who has gone through all of the reassignment surgeries and has adequate testosterone levels, and it's fair. But in reality, that is so far from the truth. All Leah Thomas really had to do to be able to compete with us was say, "I identify as a woman." And so we were not forewarned of the locker room arrangement. We knew, of course, Thomas would be competing against us, but we did not know we would be sharing this changing space. And so that first day, when Thomas, of course, walks in the locker room, drops his clothes and is undressing, the shock. The swimming locker room, I'll kind of set the scene, it's not necessarily a place of modesty. These suits you put on, if you hold it up to your body outside of the water, it looks like it could fit like a 6-year-old child. So it's like 15 minutes of full exposure trying to put yourself in these suits, but in an all-women's locker room growing up a swimmer, you become comfortable in a sense in being vulnerable in that way. But I can't tell you the extreme discomfort that I felt in that position where you have a man watching you undress. It's so twisted, clearly, and so I immediately left the locker room and I asked the NCAA, what are the guidelines that allowed this to happen? To which they told me they got around this by making the locker rooms unisex, which meant that any man could have walked into our locker room, and they didn't even tell us that. That's just how they wanted to get around it, and so I wanted to add that piece. And one more piece I wanted to mention about these NCAA championships is, of course, we had Leah Thomas, who is a male transitioning to female, but at this same meet where we had Leah Thomas, we had another transgender athlete who was female transitioning to male, who swam as a biological female only in a Speedo, who fully identified as he, him, went by the name of Isaac, and this is something I think the media has done a terrible job covering. If we were basing this off of gender identity where you compete, then why was Isaac allowed to compete with us? Again, topless. Watching the 100 freestyle final, so 2 of the top 8 qualifiers, one is a female who's swimming topless and one is a male in a woman's suit with a bulge. And it just felt like watching this, it was so twisted. And sorry to be explicit, but I want you guys to understand truthfully what we were dealing with. And so I wanted to mention that. So now to get to the Women's Bill of Rights and really what this is. Not so long ago, the meaning of words such as woman and man and male and female, these were obvious, of course. But today, gender ideologues seek to alter our common understanding of what these words mean, and they seek to force this agenda down our throats of what we have to pretend and what the language we have to use without democratic accountability. And so currently there's no law that legally defines common sex-based terms such as, again, woman, man, female, male. And so this is why the Women's Bill of Rights is crucial. It defines woman, and it defines woman as an adult human female, and then it further defines female as the biological sex that has the ability to produce eggs or ova. I can't even believe that we have to do that. I really can't. It's just so wild. Man and woman is the sheer essence of humanity, and we can't define these terms. Anyways, that's just beyond me. But I will say, I believe last year, maybe actually in 2021, Tate Reeves signed a bill that protects women's sports, which is phenomenal. Yeah. That's really great. There's only been 18 states to do so. There are more in the process this cycle. But what good is it if we can't define what it is we're even protecting? We need to make sure sex is defined, to make sure that legislation has integrity long term. And really, I want to add, this is bigger than just sports. It really is. Look at what's happening in prisons, where you have males convicted of really terrible, awful things, including rape and kidnapping and awful things, who are now identifying as a woman because they're under the assumption that women are typically treated with more ease. And so they're now identifying as women and being moved to all women's prisons. It's happening in Kansas, it's happening in New Jersey, Ohio, of course California. After one of the first few cases of this instance was approved in prisons in California, over 200 men in just a span of a few days applied to be women. And so if we don't see how people will take advantage of the system, we're blind and delusional, because we're opening doors and leading to people taking advantage of these opportunities. But this would also protect sororities. There's a case actually at, I think it's University of Washington, maybe, or actually it's Wyoming is where it is. There's a male who's in a sorority, and the girls can do absolutely nothing about it. And I've had several of these girls reach out to me. What do I do? They can't do anything. This would mean that men could take our academic and athletic scholarships, as well as living in dorm rooms with women. Look at what's happening in changing spaces, such as the YMCA and different places of this nature, and of course in women's shelters. So this protects a lot more than just women's sports. Really, anywhere the term woman is used in law, it would codify that word. And so how the analogy I like to use to think about Women's Bill of Rights is the Women's Bill of Rights is essentially the forest. And women's sports, let's say, is one tree in that forest. So that's kind of how I like to look at it. But really, over the past few years, we have seen an aggressive attempt from the left to eliminate women as a distinct legal category. So the Women's Bill of Rights, I want to add, it doesn't change any existing laws. It merely establishes a legal definition of sex-based terms. So we're all speaking in a common language when it comes to the implementation of laws that are already there. It's a declaration that words matter, that biology matters, that science matters, and that when it comes to the privacy and safety, separating the sexes is not only constitutional, again, it's common sense and it's necessary. I also want to add that this legislature, the Women's Bill of Rights, it doesn't stop any new laws from accommodating to trans-identified individuals, and it doesn't prevent protecting them from discrimination. It just stops bureaucrats and judges from erasing women's statutory rights. And so I kind of wanted to end by just saying that it doesn't make you transphobic to say that there are two sexes, to say that you can't change your sex, and to say that women deserve equal opportunities and fairness. And so I want to invite Mandy up. Again, I'm not going to try to pronounce her last name. If Douglas couldn't do it, I sure as heck can't do it. But here's Mandy, so thank you.
Riley, thank you for bringing me up. And if anyone's wondering, it's Guna Sekara, but there's not a test after this, just so you know. But I do want to start. Riley, you're such a gift. You're a gift to this movement. You're a gift to women, to women's sports. And I truly believe that what you had to go through, it's unimaginable, and I'm sorry you had to go through it, but I do believe that God is using you and raising you up to be the gift that we need right now, because so much is under attack. Certainly women's sports, and you've gone through it. We all know in this room, just from a common sense perspective, that it is a problem for you to essentially be forced into a situation where you're having to change in a locker room in front of men. I think about that personally. That seems so upsetting, but I also have a young daughter. I know a lot of you in this room have children or grandchildren, and I think about my daughter. I do not want her to be in that situation. And this rubric of Riley and other women having to go through this under the scope of progressivism is an absolute lie. It is taking away things that women have actually fought for, that actually do matter. So what truly is at stake? The other thing, Riley, that stood out as you were talking that I did want to touch on, this started for you by asking a question. And that takes so much courage. And it's crazy to think today we live in a world where standing up and asking a basic question takes courage. But it's because there are bigger forces at play. There are bigger forces to establish thought control, to make it so difficult for you to ask a question that you just fall among those who dissent, but dissent quietly. And there's bigger forces to try to devalue relationships, because the essence of relationships is a man being a man and a woman being a woman, and then creating a family and a life out of that. Those are fundamental to our existence as humans, and fundamental to so much, and so much in this country, and so many great things have come of that. So thank you for being a gift. Thank you for your courage. And it really is an honor to be here with all of you in this room. I know many of you are advocates on this particular issue, but advocates for the bigger picture of conservative ideals that also are under attack. I was looking at the list of speakers that you have coming up. Alex Epstein stuck out to me. He's a very good friend, but someone also talking about foundational aspects of our life that are under attack, and that is access to affordable, reliable energy that 80% today is delivered by fossil fuels. So I'm glad you're bringing him into this equation, because it's these fundamental aspects of our life that are under attack, and we have so much to lose. Let's talk a little bit about some of the successes we as women have experienced to date, because the law does recognize distinct biological differences. And Riley did a great job summarizing that, but I'll go into it just a little bit deeper in a second. But today, women have experienced the lowest unemployment rate since 1965. We have one of the highest rates of opening new businesses. Now, part of that is because of women-owned businesses, grants, and support that's out there. That's something that could potentially fall by the wayside if the law didn't recognize the distinct biological differences between men and women. Also, there's more women going and getting higher degrees. And again, a lot of that has to do from efforts that started in the 60s and 70s to propel women up, to help them reach the potential that previous systems held back. So much success has occurred, and certainly the establishment of Title IX and the establishment of distinct women's sports, that is so important, because at some point, usually it's a little bit before junior high, sometimes early high school, depending on genetics, really, but the differences between men's capability and women's capability in sports really comes out. And I ran cross country when I was in high school. And I actually looked today, I was thinking about it. I won state for the 3A championship. And I looked at my time, I was thinking, you know, if I'd had to compete against a guy, where would I have fallen? I wouldn't have even been in the top 10 if I'd had to compete with men in the 3A women's cross country championship here in Mississippi. But winning that changed the trajectory of my life. I got recruited to go to Mississippi College to run there, which I did. And going to Mississippi College, it's a great education, but it's still very much a faith-based education. You have to take Old Testament and New Testament. And I really think having that foundation as a part of my education gave me confidence in the work and so many big problems and big situations I've been in the future. But that all really started from sports. It's so important at every single level for women to feel like they can get out there, they compete safely, but fairly. What's going on right now is not fair. And really for me, I'd been kind of following this fluidity around what is a man and what is a woman, somewhat objectively, but it really hit home when you remember the Supreme Court Justice, at the time nominee, she's now a sitting justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Marsha Blackburn, the senator from Tennessee, asked her, "What is a woman?" And she couldn't answer. She could answer, but she refused to answer, is the bigger point. She made some statement, "Well, I'm not a biologist." You don't have to be a biologist to know what is a man and what is a woman. But we now have a Supreme Court justice who will refuse to answer the obvious. And that has so many broad implications from a legal perspective and for the opportunities that women have now and certainly may or may not have in the future. Now, Riley, she summed this up really well, but the reality is right now, men and women are equal under the law. I have a boy and I have a girl. I have a 9-year-old boy, 7-year-old girl. There's nothing, as I think about their future, that my daughter would be denied from having an opportunity to that my son would. They're equal under the law. But because they are biologically different, the law recognizes that as well. It's under something called intermediate scrutiny for any of you constitutional lawyers out there, which I know there's some of you. One of them I was sitting next to, am I cursed? But intermediate scrutiny, it means that the law can recognize differences in treatment so long as there is a compelling government interest, so long as it is substantially related to a compelling government interest. And what is that compelling government interest when it comes to the differences between men and women under the law? It's safety, it's privacy, and it's equal opportunity. And if you change the law's dynamics and you think of everything that falls under those three rubrics, that all falls by the wayside. It means that Riley's competing against guys for the NCAA championship after she's done what she's done and been so committed to her sport. Privacy, it means our daughters are going to the locker rooms or to the bathrooms, and anyone who wants to claim, well, I'm identifying as a woman today, can walk in there. We've seen how this turns out. There was an unfortunate case in Virginia where a young man, a high schooler, this was all in high school, assaulted a young woman in the bathroom. And then worse than that, the school tried to cover it up. It also exposed some of the problems with our educational system. I know former Secretary DeVos is coming soon, so I don't need to speak to that, but it exposed the danger we put our young girls, our young women, and women in by changing the application of the law in areas that are so fundamentally important in who we are and how we experience our life. The other thing I did want to add a little bit more to is the why are we doing this? Why is the Women's Bill of Rights so important? You'll hear the left say, well, this is conservatives making up problems that don't really exist. That is not true. The Women's Bill of Rights is important because it will prevent activist judges, which we know there are. There's one on the Supreme Court, but they're all over, and bureaucrats, the nameless, faceless bureaucrat that is totally detached from any degree of accountability, from changing the definition on their own accord. I have a little bit of experience with that in the environmental space, but let's just think about some of the things that the nameless, faceless bureaucrat has changed that has huge implications for our lives and our kids' lives today and grandkids. Education, think about what they've done there. They have changed what it means to be educated in this country, from learning how to read, write, and do arithmetic to a pathway to activism. Environmental protection, something I worked on. They have changed that from cleaning up the air, water, soil, reducing emissions. Now it is all about handing the keys to the economy over to leftist extremists. Immigration, they've literally changed what it means to go through a legal process to citizenship to now avoiding it altogether. And this has all been done behind the scenes by the nameless, faceless bureaucrat. And it's not just at the federal level or the state level, it is also at the corporate level. You have corporate bureaucrats that are literally going around enforcing books to be changed. The most recent one that came about, Roald Dahl books, which I grew up reading, I've been reading to my kids. They've been going through and pulling out sex-specific terms like boy and girl, and they change it to kids. They've been taking out references to mother and father. Now it's parents. I guess I'm glad they didn't put birthing people in there, but still, that's next. And that's right, that's the exact point. You give them an inch on any of this, and they will start running that mile. We've seen it in so many different applications. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the bigger picture components that are at stake. And coming back to this specific issue, as Riley said, it's not just sports, although sports are hugely important, but it's also our prisons, it's also our private spaces, and it's also that access to opportunity that women have needed and have enjoyed, and that's led to the resounding success that we have had in so many ways. And there's implications for both women and men in the context of all of this, but the burden falls to women when it comes to equal opportunity and privacy, especially when it's compromised and disregarded by the law. So Douglas, thank you for all that you've done. I also want to thank the Mississippi Center for Public Policy. I've always looked to the great work they've been doing here, but I will leave you with this. It is so important to be an active advocate and fighter for conservative values across the board. They are all under attack, and the left will try to say, 1, it's not happening, 2, you sound crazy, and 3, stop asking questions. And we can't stand for that here in Mississippi. And I think as long as we are strong and we're willing to stand up and speak out in Mississippi or Kentucky or wherever it may be, that is the best remedy to leftists trying to come in and change the trajectory of this country and undermining important foundational values that we all hold so dear. So with that, I'll step aside and thank you so much for your time and attention.
that was a tour de force from two of the most articulate speakers on this subject. So thank you, Mandy, thank you, Riley. Would you have time for maybe some 10 or 15 minutes of questions? Would that be a good idea? Maybe if you both came up here, and if you have a question you would like to put to Mandy or Riley, please raise your hand.
I have a question for Riley. And so the NCAA, can you tell me a little bit about who within that organization implemented this policy?
Absolutely.
And how one would go about challenging that within that organization?
Absolutely. So after this all happened, I tried honestly to give the NCAA some grace, which now I realize was so silly. But I stepped back and I said, okay, when were these guidelines written? What are the guidelines? How did this happen? And so I did some, of course, of my own self-research. The guidelines that allowed this to happen, which the guidelines were 1 full year of hormone suppression. That's it. They didn't test your levels. It was kind of just say, take hormones for a year and you're good to go, which we know does not have the effect of making a biological male equivalent to female in terms of athletic performance. But these rules, they were done in 2010. So I was like, okay, these rules were 12 years ago. We've evolved. You know, the NCAA, they'll revisit this, they'll reassess, they saw what happened, they'll change it. And so a few months later, I got an email from University of Kentucky alerting me that I was nominated for NCAA Woman of the Year. This is the highest, most prestigious honor for collegiate female athletes. And I was so excited I got this award because this is something that encompasses your athletic achievement, of course, your academics, your service, your leadership, your character. And so getting this award, or being nominated for the award, was so exciting for me. A few weeks later, they released a full list of the nominees, to which was not exclusive to women. Leah Thomas was nominated for NCAA Woman of the Year. So it was at this point that I realized how dumb it was to give the NCAA grace, because this didn't happen on a one-off basis. They're celebrating Leah taking opportunities from women. They're encouraging more men to do this. And so the approach I took, immediately the award became devalued and meaningless to me. I didn't even want the stupid award anymore, which was sad because I was truthfully so excited when I was nominated. But I sent letter after letter, email after email, to which there was no response. And so I decided I would make my face present to where they can't ignore me. And so I started a petition, basically saying uphold Title IX, don't discriminate on the basis of sex, to which I got in just a few days 10,000 or so signatures. And so I went down to the NCAA convention in San Antonio where they announced their Woman of the Year, and I had a rally, which was interesting to try to put together. And we also presented the NCAA directly. We handed them the petition, and then we were able to hand them a legal demand letter saying that if there's not if you don't stop discriminating on the basis of sex, there will be legal action taken, which I think is how you make changes, is we have to go for their pockets. So I alerted them that there would be legal action, but I want to add, which this piece is so important because it shows the true lack of leadership and lack of authenticity and cowardice of these people in this position. So to answer your question, who is really behind all this? The president of the NCAA, he's stepping down. I actually believe he's stepped down yesterday. His name is Mark Emmert. There's boards of governing directors and such, but ultimately Mark Emmert had the decision to allow this to happen, to which obviously he did, and he actually doubled down in his stance by releasing a statement after our NCAA championship saying that he unequivocally stood in his decision to allow Leah to compete with the women because it's based in evolving science. So when I saw him at this convention in San Antonio a few weeks ago, he looked at me and said, "Great job. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep fighting." And I was baffled. Like, are you serious? You're the one who's making this so hard. And the people that you govern, you have the power to change this, and you're going to look at me and tell me to keep doing what I'm doing, when in reality, it's impossible to make changes if people like you don't stick true to their values. And so we also bought a booth inside the convention center where athletic directors and such walked through, to which we were denied multiple times until we kind of had to make an alias for what we were actually there doing because they would never allow us to say protect women's sports there. But ultimately we bought a booth, and these athletic directors that were walking through, there was not one of them who said, when we handed them a pamphlet, we told them what we were doing, protecting women's sports, there was not one who said they disagreed. They all said, keep doing what you're doing. We just can't publicly support you, which is so frustrating because it shows the true majority of how this country really feels about this, but we're catering to a minority at the expense of females and our safety and our privacy and our dignity and our equal opportunities. So hopefully that kind of answered your question. Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's an extremely good point. There's actually governing bodies. It's so mind-blowing. Governing bodies that will actively say word for word testosterone has no effect on performance and success when it comes to transitioning athletes. But these same organizations, of course, have doping policies that claim it's cheating if you alter your body or if you're competing with more testosterone. But that's a very good point. I wish more people would use that, because doping or using testosterone or performance-enhancing drugs, it's grounds for disqualification, even if, and lifelong suspension, even if they find out after the fact you'll be stripped of your awards. And so to so delusionally say, actually I don't think it's delusional, I think they know what they're doing, to say that testosterone has no effect while simultaneously saying that taking testosterone is cheating is crazy, because on average men have 20 times more testosterone than women, and even the guidelines they set in place, like the IOC, it's 10 nanomoles per liter. The average woman, even the average elite female athlete, is 0.8 to 1.2. So these guidelines are 10 times the amount of what a woman has. But even if, let's say, even if they could have computable testosterone levels, there's still advantages that will never be mitigated, which includes the size of your lungs, your heart size, of course, your height, the size of your feet and hands. Leah Thomas's feet on the blocks took up the whole entire block. It sounds silly, but men have a 40% larger throat than women, and in swimming, that plays a huge factor, or it's a big contributor to success. And so all of these little things, even if they could be computable in testosterone levels, which they can't, there would still be advantages that would never go away. But I wish more people used the doping argument. We saw what happened in the 60s and 70s with the East Germans. It's the exact same thing happening, but actually it's worse when we have a natural male who's gone through puberty, which is irreversible, competing against women.
Bill Thomas is on a team. He's in the Ivy League. Where are the parents? Like, I appreciate that you guys are all over 18 and you're adults, but like, I read an article about.
Yeah, I know. Well, to be honest, I don't know. I'm waiting for them too. It also rings the question, where are the feminists? Where are the people who fought for women's rights? Where is Billie Jean King, who was a trailblazer for women's sports? Oh, well, you know where she is? She's actively fighting for trans inclusion in women's sports. Where is Megan Rapinoe, who, no, I don't necessarily like her, but she is someone who fought for equal pay and equal resources and equal access for women. Where is she? Oh, she's actively advocating for trans inclusion in women's sports. And so it feels so twisted. These people who fought relentlessly to give women the opportunity to compete are now actively doing the opposite. And I want to add that both Billie Jean King and Megan Rapinoe don't have children. They're done competing, so what's at stake for them? Nothing. They'd rather be perceived as kind and inclusive, when in reality it's not kind to affirm someone's dysphoria, and it's not inclusive, these policies. In reality, it's excluding women. But I can tell you how my dad felt. My dad, who we have mentioned, his gracious big heart, he's also a dad who could probably kill someone. If he has, I maybe wouldn't even be surprised. But he's someone, when I informed him of the locker room situation, he told me he'd go down there and handle it himself. And I said, Dad, we already have one man in the locker room, we don't need two. But, and I don't know where the parents are. There's few parents who have put themselves out there. They have corporate jobs. They're scared to speak up. There's actually a girl in Vermont who is 14 years old. She's in high school. She's on the volleyball team, and they have a male athlete on her volleyball team. And they were sharing a locker room, and so she immediately leaves the locker room and asks her school, like, hey, what's happening? She got suspended from her school, and her dad then got fired from his job for misgendering. Amity was his name. And so the only reason they finally allowed her back into school is because they announced there's a lawsuit. But that's happening. That's not unique. I could list example after example after example of women losing out on opportunities. And really, this whole thing flying under the radar. There's a diver at a D3 university who's a man who no one knows about. There's a player at Syracuse lacrosse team who's a man who no one knows about. There's a player at University of Southern California who's a man that no one knows about. It's happening at a rampant rate. And so to go off Mandy's point that the left likes to say this is a non-issue, or a lot of what I'm seeing in these state legislatures, these bills being passed, the people in opposition say, there's 4 transgender athletes in Kansas, why does it matter? That's not true. There might be 4 transgender athletes on one team, it's just not reported. It's happening at an alarming rate across all sports, ranging from pee-wee to senior division sports. I talked to a lady who's 65 who's competing against a male in golf. It's happening across all ages, all sports, and to believe it's a non-issue is just a lie.
Time for a couple more questions, yes.
Okay, so I know that Mississippi passed legislation 2 years ago that would protect women's sports. But obviously, we don't have anything that protects our children in elementary schools and high schools and the bathrooms that they're using. What is it, and this might be for Mandy, what is it that we need to pass? What type of legislation do we need to pass? Do we need to be talking to our legislators about, our representatives about, that we need in Mississippi that will, I guess, protect women in all aspects?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Riley she touched on this when she basically said the sports is a tree and there's a much larger forest. All these issues are at stake, and it's women of any age. The best thing we could do is to pass the Women's Bill of Rights, and it is designed, all that it does is it codifies the existing interpretation and definition of how sex-based policies are treated under the rubric of intermediate scrutiny. And so it locks this in, and what it will do is it will ensure that you can have, there is a legally derived distinction between men and women that can be applied in private spaces, that can be applied in prisons, that can be applied in sports. So passing something like the Women's Bill of Rights, it is intentionally drafted to be all-encompassing, but not creating new rights. So it really is just codifying what was normal up until, or what was standard interpretation until, this more recent movement has overtaken. So it's as simple as passing the Bill of Rights, the Women's Bill of Rights.
We have time for one last question. Yes, the gentleman there.
I think that the fear of speaking out in this country is pervasive. Listening to you, I'm wondering, is there any, I know you've given your story of what you went through, but how widely is what you're doing being noticed and accepted by women in your field? And what kind of response have you gotten from them?
Absolutely. And I think that's really important, because I think the media wants you to think or these large organizations or companies or universities, they want you to think you will be scrutinized, you will be canceled, you will be called a transphobic, hateful bigot. I have had so much support, it's insane. Of course, I do experience some flack, but the only negative I receive is personal attacks. Like, you should have just swam faster, why didn't you train harder? Or your hair is extensions, which it's not. Or you're ugly, like just stuff that doesn't bother me. And so no one can undermine my argument, because my argument is my experience, exactly what happened. There's nothing really that I even said today that is that opinionated. Because I'm not speaking from my opinions, I'm speaking from exactly what we dealt with, exactly what we were subjected to. And so when I'm up here speaking, I am speaking for so much more than just myself. I have athletes, parents, professional athletes, Olympians, the most successful athletes you can imagine have reached out to me and said, thank you for doing what you're doing. Can't publicly support you because I'll lose sponsorships, or all of these other very stupid excuses, which honestly at first when these people were reaching out to me saying thank you, like I'll support you privately, I was so humbled. I was like, wow, I'm honored. But now, a year after this has happened, I'm not honored when someone says this to me. Silence, I've realized, is complicity. And so by being quiet, you're actively okay with what's happening. But I will speak for Leah Thomas's teammates, who what they went through is so much worse than what I can even put into words. One of Leah Thomas's teammates, who obviously I won't mention her name, but when she was in high school, actually, she was violently raped, which is obviously a traumatic experience for anyone. And so when Leah began to transition, it was very triggering for her, and it caused her extreme anxiety and trauma. And so she immediately sat down with her coaches and said, hey, this is my past. I love Leah, but is there some other accommodation we can have here, because this is really hard for me? And her coaches said, no, sorry. You just have to be kind. You just have to be inclusive. It's more important than your mental health or your safety or your fairness. And so hearing all of their stories is far worse than what I've described to you guys. They dealt with it every day. And so I am speaking for much more than just myself, and I know this because they reach out to me privately. So I'm trying to figure out ways to be able to band us together, even if they do want to remain anonymous, because I know people are sick of hearing me and looking at me. I'm sick of hearing me and looking at me. And so I'm trying to figure out ways that people in administrative positions, like athletic directors, or people who are privately thanking me, how can we show that we are the majority here? How can we expose what's really happening? And so that's kind of my project that I've been doing. And I want to add, my life has changed drastically. I was supposed to be in dental school this year, and so I've put that off because I realized that it would be a disservice to not continue fighting this. And so now I'm set to go to dental school this fall, but I still feel like the torch has been lit, but who to pass it to? Who is willing to fight this? And so I have no background in public speaking, clearly. I have no background in policies and politics and any of this stuff, but I do still know what a man and a woman is. So